do a little thing with somebody you might know. So come on up here. You can just come right up, sit right up here. Go ahead and sit down right there. Yeah. Cool. You probably recognize the individual that I have right here. See that? You can turn towards me. That was you. It's all cool. So, who do I have in my hands? Sir, Mr. Potato Head. Yeah. And he's got a few pieces on already, right? What pieces are on? Nose. We got mustache. What else? Mouth. Yep. So he has some pieces missing, right? So what are the pieces that are missing? Ears. Yeah. So we got to put some ears on him. Yep. Big ears. Yes. That looks better, doesn't it? What else is missing? Eyes. Yep, we got those.
Big blue eyes.
They're not big blue eyes, they're big black eyes. There you go. Now, what else is missing?
A brain.
A brain. Well, I don't know about that. Arms, yeah. Arms and hands.
Legs. Feet.
All right, so we got that. So, why am I talking about Mr. Potato Head in church? It's really interesting because I don't know if you listen, but we just heard an old man talking. He was Great Grandpa John. He was really old when he wrote that. And he was one of the first disciples. And he said some really interesting things. He said, we have heard with our ears, we have seen with our eyes, and we have actually touched with our hands God. Isn't that something? And that's mind-blowing, isn't it? What he's saying is we actually met God and we used all those senses that we have. They probably even smelled him too, right? After a long day, he probably stank. But his point was, God isn't just some invisible being, but he was who? Jesus. And that's pretty amazing. And that's what Great Grandpa John wants you to know, is how real Jesus is. And even though you and I don't get to touch him and see him and hear him physically, he's just as real because he gives us his spirit. And he will always be with us just like he had been with John, Great Grandpa John. So, Mr. Potato Head gives us some good insights on how real Jesus is. Thanks for coming up. You guys go on up. And in the meantime, everybody else, you can pull out your worship folder, and the outline will be on that. And we'll get ready for the message. We're going to start off the message today with a video. That's just a brief introduction to a different. We just had Mr. Potato Head. That video is actually entitled Mrs. Potato Head. And that video is really powerful, and it's also really disturbing. In that video, we have a young lady, and she is being influenced by media to be different, isn't she? And we're not going to show the whole video, but in that video, what happens is she goes through a process where she actually changes herself. She loses her identity of who she is to try and be different. And what she's really looking for is acceptance and love. What does it mean to be different? We're going to take a look at that today as we start this new series called Still Different. It's from the message of 1 John that we heard just a couple of minutes ago. But in this, you know, the question is what is different? And different ties so much into who am I, what's my identity, and why do I need to be different? Why am I always chasing after something to do differently or to be differently? The other night, Karen and Nathan and I were at home, and we turned on the hockey championship, the Stanley Cup final. It was Game 7. And it was a really good game, but the thing of it is, it's really interesting because none of us are hockey fans. Now, the hockey was awesome, but we're not hockey fans. Can we turn up the lights a little bit, please? We're not hockey fans. So why were we watching this hockey game? The reason we were watching is because I actually grew up in St. Louis, and one of the teams was the St. Louis Blues. And so I have this weird association of my identity with St. Louis sports teams. And so watching the Blues, which by the way they won and became NHL champions for the first time in their history, which was really exciting. But notice how we do that. Whether it's a sports team, for you Packer fans, or whether it's a hobby that you do, or maybe it's even your work. We take all these things and we're looking for different things, and we even get bored. And we do those so often saying, that's really a part of my identity. And the culture is always trying to get us to do new and different things, to be different. And sometimes it's at the expense of my true identity. And that's why we want to take a look at this series, Still Different. You see, the title of the series is based upon what Great-Grandpa John, that we just did with Mr. Potato Head, Great-Grandpa John was the last of the first 12 disciples. And now he was literally a great-grandpa. Because this was written probably between 90 and 100 AD. So we're talking 60 to 70 years after Jesus had ascended into heaven. And John is a really old man. And something amazing about John is he was still different. He had encountered Jesus decades before, but he was still different. However, the second and the third generations and even the fourth generation after him, they were struggling with being still different. There was weird spirituality going on in the world. It was very worldly. There was a whole lot of sexual temptation. Sound familiar? So today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this and ask a question over the next several weeks. Are you still different? If you're a Christian here, forget if you're a Christian here. Just think. What do people say about you that you're different? What do they say about you? I bet you that every one of us can stop and say, yeah, they say this and it's kind of weird. But they say this and it's kind of good, isn't it? Because we're a mixed bag that way. Now, if you're a Christian, are they saying you're different like Jesus? And if not, Why not? And if you're still on the journey and you're trying to figure it out, this whole God thing yet, what do you keep looking for that's different to bring a clear sense of identity of who you are? So we're going to ask that question. Not only what makes you different, but this. What are you looking for that's different that tempts you to sacrifice your true identity of who you are? Where are you tempted in the world to do different or to be different? So let's take a look at this. The first thing we're going to do is what does it mean to be different? Now, there was, as far back as the year 500, his name was Augustine. Augustine was not a Christian growing up. He had a grandmother. He says he came to faith because grandma prayed me to faith. Augustine was a wild party animal man, enjoyed the life, but then he came to faith in Jesus. And he wrote this question: how can you draw close to God when you are far away from yourself? How can you draw close to God when you are far away from yourself? I think he wrote that experientially because I know that I can tell you when I was in my early years and I was in the party world, living it up, there were reasons. And part of that was not really knowing who I was. A lot of deep insecurities, trying to run away. 1,000 years later, a man named John Calvin, one of the reformers of the Reformation movement, said, our wisdom consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. And then he continued, he says, but as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other. In other words, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do you have to know God first? Or do you have to know yourself first? Because if you have to know yourself to know God, but you got to know God to know yourself, which comes first? And so what we're going to do is we're going to listen to this old great-grandpa John. You should have put like on the old, beard so I could be old great-grandpa John. Because he had met Jesus. And we're going to listen to a few of his words because, you see, knowing God has been going on for about ever. Right? After the Tower of Babel, when everything got confused and people went off in all different directions and had different languages, people have been trying to find God. And the picture here is a Buddha statue. Buddha lived in about 700 BC, 700 years before Jesus was even born. Actually, about the time that Isaiah lived. Just different parts of the world, right? Both of them searching for what is God. And Buddha, his roots came from Hinduism. Hinduism goes back as far as like 4,000 years before Jesus was even born. It's as old as Judaism. They are the two oldest religions in the world. And what are people doing? They're trying to figure out what is God like. And then you've got Islam today, where people believe in the Prophet Muhammad and worship Allah. And there's over 1 billion people who are Muslims today, second largest religion in the world. They're trying to figure out what God is like. And then you've got general spirituality today that lots of people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Actually, I like that in many respects. And we've learned how New Age spirituality says that I am really God myself, and my problem is I just don't realize I'm God. That would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it? Probably create a whole lot more, too. So then we get to Great-Grandpa John, right? And Great-Grandpa John, he says, what does it mean to be different? And what it means to be different for him starts with knowing God. You see, the world and the media, I started with that video because that little girl, she symbolizes all of us. Constantly being bombarded by the world telling us we're not complete, we need to be different, we need to do something different. And so great-grandpa John is going to give us insights to be able to fight that off and to find true peace and true contentment. And not only that, but how to be able to interact with people in the world so that they can know Christ and know that as well. So the first thing that he says is, different is timeless. 1 John chapter 1, verse 1. He says, what was from the beginning? Now, great-grandpa John had a really good memory. Unlike me, this is one of my fears as I grow older, because my memory already is not the best. But great-grandpa John had a good memory and a good knowledge of the Bible. And so that whole thing, the beginning, becomes a really key part of what he was saying. He says, what was from the beginning refers all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. This is where you got to put on your thinking caps. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then it goes on through, he created everything else. He created mankind. And John is saying, what was from the beginning was already there at the beginning. In the beginning, God. And then in his gospel, he reiterates this. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You see, John is taken, if you've ever weaved a tapestry, you know, and he takes and he weaves this thing, the beginning, all the way from the beginning to the end. From the start of the Bible all the way to the end of the Bible. And what he says is different became human. Mr. Potato Head, this is what John said. What we heard, what we've seen, and what we have touched. You see, John, with his own ears, heard Jesus. With his own eyes, he saw Jesus die. He saw Jesus rise from the dead. He spent 50 days with Jesus after he rose from the dead. He saw Jesus literally ascend into heaven. That made him different forever. He touched Jesus. He touched the nail-scarred hands, the hole in his side. He experienced all of that. And he says, what we have heard, what we have seen, what we have touched, he became human. He says, the life was revealed. He gets really specific in all of this, probably more specific than we're used to getting. Not a life, but the life that gives life to all people was revealed. So the Word became human and made his home among us. God came down, and I saw it. I saw him with my eyes, heard him with my ears, touched him. And that's why I'm different, and that's what I want to pass on to you. He says that we have seen and witnessed and proclaimed to you Jesus, right? The life eternal, which was with the Father, and he was unveiled to us. This afternoon, some of us are going to go, in my family, we're going to go to an art show in Virginia Beach. And what do the artists do? They put their stuff out and they unveil it so that people can see what they've done. When Jesus came, God was saying, I am unveiling who I really am. If you want to know what God is like, Jesus is it. The point becomes you can't really know who you are if you don't know who God is. Because he created you. And he loves you dearly. John says, I am different because I experienced Jesus. Now, that all sounds really well and good, but what does that have to do with life? What does that have to do with being a young married couple and how we live together? What does that have to do with being an athlete? What does that have to do with struggling with cancer? What does that have to do with being a single parent? What does that have to do with my marriage that's struggling? What does that have to do with my future in college? That's what we need to get to, because that's where we live life. So, John invites us to make sure that we're different too. Here's what he says. He says, what we have seen and what we have heard, we proclaim to you so that you might have fellowship with us. I want to share with you something that happened. Demi Lee Brennan. Demi Lee Brennan was from Australia, and in January of 2008, she got a liver transplant. And in the liver transplant, an amazing, miraculous thing happened. Her blood type actually changed. She went from O negative to O positive blood type. Now, I'm not a medical person, so I got to read this to make sure that I get it right. Because otherwise, you medical people are going to come up and correct me afterwards. Because you've done that before. It says that the blood stem cells invaded the bone marrow, which took over the immune system, and then created an entirely different blood type. So the blood type, the O negative that she had that was killing her, became O positive, and it gave life. And they said the odds of this happening are 1 in 6 billion. Isn't that amazing? John says our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And here's the point of the change of blood type. From a spiritual perspective, when you come to faith in Jesus Christ, he changes your spiritual blood type. Before you have Jesus, you continue to live with a brokenness and a sinful nature. And when you put your faith in Jesus, he says, your blood type has been changed. You're now O positive, not O negative. And I can give you the strength to be able to handle all the different kinds of struggles that you have, no matter what it is. And we have them every single day. Because as I look around this group, I see you, and I know most of them because you've told me what they are. Each is different, but each is an incredible struggle. And yet Jesus says, I give you a strength to love like you've never had before. And he says, and as you live that out, that's how you add people to God's family. That's part of the purpose. John says, these things we write in order that our joy might be complete. I heard a story recently. It was by a guy who used to be in ministry. And what he said was, I was in ministry, then I went into business, and I did volunteer, and I still love to hang out with high school kids. And he said, I sat down with one having a Coke, and dads will like this. The son said to this guy, he said, you know what, don't tell my dad this, but my dad's almost always right. But he went on and said, you know, I know a lot of dads. And I know a lot of dads, and they don't spend their time with their kids. And if you're only talking with your kids when the TV's on, or when there's a digital instrument going, or when you're lecturing them, been guilty of that, right? What will happen is, you may have great wisdom to provide. And as a follower of Christ, you may have great wisdom to provide, but they'll never listen. And then your joy won't be complete. I got thinking, some people say, you know what? I quit worrying about what other people think of me. That's not really impressive. I know lots of people who have quit worrying about what other people think of them. But what's really impressive is people who say, I quit worrying about what other people think of me, but I still listen to what other people think of me. Did you catch that? See, I don't worry about what other people think of me, but I listen to what other people think of me because guess what? I'm not perfect yet. Even though Jesus may have given me forgiveness and an O positive, I need to listen to what my spouse says because I may have blind spots and she has insights. I need to listen to what my kids say about me because they may see some things that I don't see. And there's an amazing thing that happens when I do that. I quit worrying about defending myself. I surrender what other people think of me to God. And then an amazing, powerful thing happens. I quit judging other people. That's what John is getting at. What does it mean to be still different? As I go through life, he says, we've met the one who was from the beginning, God Almighty. He came to us in the person of Jesus Christ. We've seen him with our ears, heard him with our ears, seen him with our eyes, touched him with our hands, and we have fellowship. We have a relationship. We've been changed. And now we want to proclaim to you about this Jesus. What Wayne did earlier today when he gave that praise report, that's incredible because Wayne just came to faith a few years ago. And Wayne has been learning. He's like, what can I do for God? And he's at work. And he's got somebody who's hurting. And he starts praying. And God gives him an idea. And he reaches out to help him. Now your next step, Wayne, is to look for the opportunity to tell him about Jesus. Right? Peter Cesaro is a pastor, and he talks about emotionally healthy spirituality. He says this, we are actually called to be an alternative, different community, to be a sign to the world that Jesus has made possible a way of life unlike anything the world has seen. And you do that by being defensive, right? That doesn't work, does it? And where's the hardest place to do that? Dads, at home. He continues, he says, we bear witness to the power of God by the way we live authentically and with integrity out of our true selves. Just being real. Make a mistake, take responsibility for it. I messed up. Somebody doesn't like what you have to say or what you've done, listen to them. You don't have to agree with them, but you can listen to them. And when we practice this at home, if we practice this at home, it's a whole lot easier out in the world, isn't it? And our calling as Christians is just to live this authentic life of being changed from an O- blood type to an O+ blood type, a spiritual type, that God says, I love you and I care for you. That's what it means to be different. It's just to be real. You don't have to chase something different. And by the way, as parents, we have to live this authentically because if we don't live it out, we can't tell it out to our kids. And as for all of us, that video to start, which by the way, I challenge you to go home and look at that. It's disturbing, but it's really powerful. That video had 82 million views. 82 million views. And I just bet you how many girls, teens, have seen that video 25 times. It's just confusing. And we as Christians need to be intentional about who has God put in my life. Are we different? Or are we just like the rest of the world? Because we have a calling. It's to make disciples. How do you do that? By showing the love of Christ. Don't be someone different, be who you are. Don't be chasing all the different things in the world. Just be who you are, and that should be different. Surrender the protection of self will surrender the rejection of others. You won't be judging others if you give yourself to God. So, Jesus is a difference maker, and he makes us different. And so this week, here's the things that I want you to do. The first one is I want you to start a journal for this series. For you 1%ers, start a journal, and the first thing I want you to write in it is, what have I heard from people that makes me different? Write down the things that make you different. Positive, negative. Think about that. And then, what characteristics would I want included in my different label? If I could say, God, I want to be, what would you put in there? God, I want to be more kind. That'd be a great one. You know that's really underrated today. God, I just want to be more kind. Put it in there and start praying for that. Now, remember, when you pray for it, he'll probably give you an opportunity to be that way. It won't be fun. It's like when you pray for patience. He gives you good reasons to learn that. But if you're not intentional, you'll be like, wow, that was, oh well, it's Monday. And the third thing is, thank God for your faith. If you have faith already, thank God for your faith. And then start recording ways in which you're living differently. And celebrate those. I had one this week that was specifically, I remember, it's like something happened and I normally would have done this, but I went, no, that's not the best thing, and I did this. I was like, that's really awesome. And started at home. And don't give me that look. It's the toughest place to start, isn't it? But it's the most powerful, because if you can do it at home, then you can do it in the world. So, then come back next week, because we're going to look in more depth. How do you know if you're different? We're going to look at 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. So, still different. Great-grandpa John, he was very real. He was very different because he met Jesus. And he wants the generations after, including us, to walk in that. Let's pray. Lord, we come to you today and we thank you so much. We ask your blessing that we can be different.